Today's title is Our Hardenbergh Hike Through History. It'll really be a hike through history, art, and nature. So begin, hopefully, if you've not yet seen it, you will go to see it. The great exhibition of Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh's works on right now at Morven Museum. And instead of the art itself, though, I'm going to kind of give you three different complementary subjects that are interesting in themselves and then might also make either your first visit or your return visit before it goes to the Hardenbergh art exhibition even more interesting than the great works of art themselves. And yes, we're looking right now at Old Dutch Parsonage, State Historic Site in Somerville, with a little bit of a different angle, just to kind of give it a sense of its own place in the natural world around it. What you see here is actually a stream that used to meander underneath where the Old Dutch Parsonage sits today, the brick structure there on the right. And the Old Dutch Parsonage is where I'm an interpreter. And what got me first interested in this subject was when, almost 2 years ago, I guess now, I saw this exhibition advertised at Morven. And I saw those names, Gerard, Ruckers, Hardenbergh. And I thought, that's got to have something to do with this place, because this was the home of the Hardenbergh family, who went on to found the university that is today, Rutgers. So that sets up our kind of interest, why we're beginning our virtual hike up here in Somerville at the Old Dutch Parsonage. So the next slide, please, Debbie. So to begin, Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh, if you have seen the exhibition, right, he worked in New Jersey around the turn of the century, or the turn of the last century, late 19th century and into the early 20th century. But his family history goes back to the colonial period in New Jersey. He is descended both from a Dutch New Yorker and from a Dutch woman. The first ancestor that we'll look at of Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh on his paternal side, so his father's side, the Hardenbergh component of his double name, is Dina van Berg. Dina van Berg was born in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And we know quite a bit about Dina van Berg, thankfully, unusually for a woman, unfortunately, in this period, because she kept a pretty fascinating diary. And not only did she keep that diary, but it survives today. It is, of course, written in Dutch. That was the language of Dina van Berg's youth. And so I have not read the diary in its original, but another thankful gift we have is that the diary has been translated. And it survives today in parts, one part at the Rutgers University Library and another part at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary's library. The other kind of evidence piece of material culture we have of Dina van Berg is the dress that you see pictured here. So this picture is also borrowed from the Rutgers University Libraries, where they hold Dina van Berg's dress in their collection. Traditionally, this was called Dina van Berg's wedding dress. The archivists at the library have told me that they are not so confident in the exact identification of this gown as a wedding dress, but they are confident in the provenance that it is Dina van Berg's. And presumably, very often in this period, you don't buy a special wedding gown necessarily. You might wear whatever is your most finest piece of clothing to a wedding. So perhaps Dina van Berg did wear this at a wedding, but the weddings are what bring her here first into New Jersey and then into the Hardenbergh family. Dina van Berg, in her diary, talks about her pietism. This was a religious movement in Europe around the 1740s and 1750s that emphasized a very close and individual relationship with God. And it could be pretty severe. So to kind of explain what that means is that, yes, Dina van Berg has her time closeted away in prayer that she describes in her diary. And she talks about waking up in the morning and having words of scripture, or sometimes unknown sources coming to her mind, always in a very kind of religious sense. But her diary also tells us about her social life and how her pietism informed that social life. She went to church on Sundays, where she heard a male minister preach. But on Wednesdays, she was the leader in her conventicle, her gathering of female friends who would read scripture together, pray the Psalms, and sometimes offer their own views of what the best interpretation of a scripture piece or sermon ought to be. Dina van Berg recorded politics, again, always from the religious perspective, but in her diary, she discusses the war with France, a war that had religious overtones in the middle of the 18th century, the Protestant Dutch at war with the Catholic French. In one passage, just to give you a sense of how serious and maybe severe these views are, Dina kind of reflects that she's very confident that God will see the Dutch safely through this war. But she goes on to reflect that even if the French do win, well, that's okay too, because, you know, I'm in such a nation of sinners that we might need a little bit of a wake-up call from time to time. So that's a very severe, but shows you how seriously she took the pietism of the Dutch Reformed Church. She was quite surprised when a visiting minister from New Jersey not only met her, but proposed marriage to her. This minister was Johannes Frelinghuysen, the, of course, grandfather of another prominent New Jersey family. Johannes Frelinghuysen was born in New Jersey, traveled to Amsterdam to obtain his license to preach, and then upon receiving that license, met and proposed marriage to Dina van Berg. She thankfully wrote about it, and we know that she was very reluctant to accept that proposal. It would mean not only marriage to a minister's wife, but emigration to a colony under a foreign power and speaking a totally different language, belonging to a totally different political system. Eventually, though, Dina van Berg comes around to the idea, even though her own family discourages it, seeing it as kind of an opportunity for her in herself to carry out a calling, go among people of a foreign land, speaking a foreign tongue, and sort of extend what she calls Dutch Zion in her writing. So very much there's kind of a Dutch mission to her decision to marry and move to New Jersey. And I like, as a final comment here with Dina, I like the dress because it shows us that for all the severity and pietism we get in this woman in her writings, she is an upper class woman, but an elegant woman of her time. She's wearing a dress that, you know, maybe is a little more toned down than an Annis Stockton might have preferred, but still nonetheless is part of that kind of a larger Georgian social world. She has flowers. She's not just wearing some kind of black muted tones all the time. So it gives us kind of something beyond what just the writing itself offers us in terms of understanding this woman. When she moved to New Jersey, her husband began the practice of inviting students to live and board in their house. And we can go to the next slide on that note. You ready, Debbie? And this will then bring together the Reverend Jacob Routzen Hardenbergh, or the future Reverend Jacob Routzen Hardenbergh, to New Jersey and to the into the same house as Dina van Berg. The Old Dutch Parsonage was the first home into which Dina van Berg arrived upon her move to New Jersey in 1751 with her new husband. And in addition to her husband, to their two children, they would also have about 4 or 5 young men, all Dutch men, Dutch Americans though, living and boarding in the house with them too. These men were preparing to become ministers in the Dutch Reformed Church. There is, of course, no seminary in America. So just as an aspiring lawyer would read the law with another lawyer during this period, an aspiring minister will live and board and study with a minister of that denomination to learn the ways of that profession, of that vocation. The Reverend Hardenbergh came as a student to Reverend Frelinghuysen's house from Ulster County, New York, a very heavily Dutch area that all belonged to what was once New Netherland before the English takeover. Within a few years, however, Reverend Frelinghuysen died, and that left both Dina van Berg and Jacob Hardenbergh in an uncertain state. Dina van Berg considered returning home to the Netherlands. And in an interesting letter during that period where she considers returning home, she mentions the presence of the students in her house. This is several months after her husband had died, but she mentions that I send the regards of the students to one of her correspondents. Obviously, that indicates that the students must have remained in the house even after their teacher had died. My question is, we know from her earlier writings how deeply well-read, how committed Dina van Berg is to the Dutch Reformed faith, to the study of scripture and prayer. Was she ever involved in any way in the instruction, in the formation, even if just in a casual way, of these young men? Or am I getting a little too imaginative in my historical inference, and she truly was just there as keeping the room and board, and the students had decided to hang on a few more months until they had their own positions sorted? One of these kind of questions that I don't propose to have an answer, but I think is worth kind of reflecting on and considering. There must have been some relationship, however, because within the next 2 years, Jacob Hardenbergh, the student, would become the new minister and take over the ministry that was run out of the Dutch parsonage. He also saw Dina van Berg and figured she was doing her job well enough, and so he proposed marriage to her in her second startling proposal of marriage. And Dina van Berg changed her mind. She was very close to returning to the Netherlands, but she accepted this marriage proposal too. And she would, as a result, remain in residence at the old Dutch parsonage and be the minister's wife a second time, this time to the Reverend Hardenbergh. They would be in the old Dutch parsonage together for the next really 25 years. It would be during that period that Jacob Hardenbergh, pictured here, would lead the effort to charter a formal college for the Dutch in New Jersey. The charter for Queen's College was granted 255 years ago today, on November the 10th of 1766. And so we are here today on Queen's College Charter Day. That was New Jersey's second colonial college, of course, Princeton being the first. If you're ready, the next slide, Debbie. Well, as we discussed the Hardenbergh family, it's worth noting too that out of Ulster County, New York, came a whole not only Dutch, but of course African Dutch tradition, made by the grim reality of the slavery of Africans and African Americans in both New York and New Jersey, and including among the Dutch-speaking population. I bring in Sojourner Truth as a recognizable name because Sojourner Truth was born into slavery on the same plantation into which Jacob Hardenbergh was born into freedom. It was Jacob Hardenbergh's brother and then nephew who were the earliest slaveholders of Sojourner Truth. She was born Isabella Bomefree, the name Bomefree coming from her father's name, also an enslaved African New Yorker. His name itself, a Dutch term meaning like a strong, sturdy tree. And Sojourner Truth spoke Dutch as her first language until the age of 10. So when we recall her later life as an activist, her main tool for activism, supporting women's suffrage and opposing slavery, was speaking, oratory. And really, she was a speaker using her second language, right? And she would have always carried kind of the Dutch rhetorical tradition of Ulster County, New York with her. So a case of bringing together both the kind of really pietism in a way, the really the Christian commitment of the Dutch Reformed Church, at the same time that her mother helped to instruct her, and also an African New Yorker, but instructed her in the prayers, the Lord's Prayer, as she recalls, at the same time bringing her essential perspective as a Black woman to bear on that Christian belief, sort of taking it to another level, sort of bridging what was the first Great Awakening of the old Dutch parsonage into the second Great Awakening of upstate New York in the next century. Rutgers University recently renamed a building Sojourner Truth Apartments, and their connection is through the Hardenbergh family. So although she did not live at the old Dutch parsonage or at Rutgers, it is a well-known connection that kind of bridges these gaps. The Hardenbergh family would lead New Jersey, in a sense, through the American Revolution. Reverend Hardenbergh was a delegate to the Provincial Congress of New Jersey that adopted New Jersey's first constitution. And then after the Revolutionary War, Reverend Hardenbergh would serve as the first full president of Queen's College, which he had helped to found. Even after his death, Dina van Berg remained involved. So after the death of her second husband, we know that after her husband's death, she writes a letter trying to recruit the next president. And she remained active in the Dutch Reformed Church of New Brunswick and was buried there. Today, that's the first Reformed Church of New Brunswick, where in recent years, they have launched a new ministry providing affordable shelter for women and children. And the name of their housing apartments built into their old church structure is Dina's Dwellings. Kind of a fascinating glimpse of this community 200 years later, referring to this woman as part of their ongoing ministry in the present. But between Dina van Berg and Jacob Hardenbergh will be another Jacob Rutsen Hardenbergh, one of their sons, that will eventually lead to, that's the paternal family of Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh. So we'll move to the next slide. And what's the other part of that artist's name? Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh. Rutgers is not only a last name, it was actually his mother's maiden name. So Gerard's, the artist featured at Morven, his mother was Cornelia van Rensselaer Rutgers, which just brings in a whole nother old Dutch family of the region, but we'll keep it focused on Ruckers today. Colonel Henry Ruckers is actually not from New Jersey, although he's from New York, part of the old New Netherland of New Jersey and New York. Henry Ruckers his family lived in and out just outside New York City. He's called Colonel Henry Ruckers because of his service in the New York militia during the American Revolutionary War. He was a quartermaster, so essential in building a lot of the supply chains that made the New York militia function in their support of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary cause. Colonel Ruckers himself did not attend the university that bears his name. He went to King's College, which is today Columbia, which was chartered just a few years before Queen's College, which is today Rutgers. But after the Revolutionary War, Colonel Henry Ruckers was very much involved, not only in Queen's College specifically, but in the general Dutch Reformed Church and also in educational causes at large. He was a trustee of Queen's College. He was also a trustee of Princeton, the College of New Jersey. So it shows you that although he was involved in Queen's, that was not an exclusive bond. And Colonel Ruckers had actually left the trustees of Queen's College when in 1825, one of the theology professors was going to take over as the new president. In this era, the college decided that they wanted to take a new name. The name Queen's College was the name they still bore. That was given to them by the royal governor of New Jersey, William Franklin, during the colonial period in honor to Queen Charlotte, King George III's consort. And I assume kind of a follow-up to just a few years earlier, King's College had been founded in New York. And the new president of the college proposed renaming the institution for Colonel Henry Ruckers. So why did they do this? I think on two levels. You can look at the small level. The immediate reason was, well, this is a man who is obviously a major philanthropist. The important thing to note is this was not a thank you for a gift. This was an anticipation to kind of reel in a gift. They were not thanking Colonel Henry Ruckers for making a massive contribution. They were hoping he would see this gesture and provide something in return. And in November of 1825, a lot of Rutgers history in November, I guess, they decided to, they officially, with the legislature's support, changed the name from Queen's College to Rutgers College. Colonel Ruckers was apparently honored, and he did send a gift of a new bell. He funded the purchase of a bell for the college. That bell still sits in the cupola of Old Queens on the historic campus of Rutgers on College Avenue in New Brunswick today. I believe it's a tradition to ring it on the charter day. So it was rung just earlier this day, November the 10th. And he also provided a small gift of a bond to the church that was used to fund scholarships, basically, for ministerial students. But on Colonel Ruckers' death, there were many great gifts to churches and educational institutions, but none such gift to Rutgers College. Nonetheless, the name stuck. On the larger level, though, this isn't just kind of a quirky story of one odd president choosing this guy's name. There is a whole wave of naming and renaming after the Revolutionary War, and actually especially after the War of 1812. Princeton, of course, still bears a royal name, but just to the south was the English village of Maidenhead. And Maidenhead, and it has been in the news in more recent years. It's the constituency that Theresa May, the former prime minister, represents in Parliament, in the British Parliament to this day. It's a small town near Windsor Castle. But after the War of 1812, the people of Maidenhead decided that we can't have an English name anymore. We're going to Lawrence. Who's Lawrence? Don't give up the ship, right? A great sort of hero of the recent conflict with Great Britain. And so King's College as well will do this, right? They drop the name King's, they take the name Columbia, kind of centering themselves directly in the Western Hemisphere. So not only is Colonel Henry Ruckers the name rechanged because of the particular interest in soliciting a donation, but I think you can also see this larger act at play of trying to give American, and in this case, Dutch American, names to some of these institutions. And we can go to the next slide. And I bring in the case of Paul Robeson, just because as we have gone through we're talking about naming and renaming after the War of 1812, perhaps we're in a similar age now, right? In news and discussions lately, all kinds of talk about whether, even in the case of Ruckers itself, Colonel Ruckers was a slaveholder, and large parts of his family's wealth in New York were based on plantations where slavery was practiced. One of the proposals has been to rename Rutgers College Robeson, after Paul Robeson, who in 1914 was an alumnus of Rutgers and a pioneer both as an artist, an athlete, and an activist throughout the 20th century. Paul Robeson, beyond Rutgers, of course, has a little link that ties both Princeton and Somerville. You will know him as a Princeton figure because he is born in Princeton, but he was also a Somerville figure. During his childhood, his father took on the ministry of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, St. Thomas AME in Somerville, and he was a graduate of Somerville High School as well. So I think our Old Dutch parsonage, between these two tangential connections, as the founder of Rutgers, but the neighbor to Somerville High School, kind of has a tie in there. What names things should bear is obviously a question for those communities to consider today. Bringing not so much to suggest where a name should be changed, but just to show that this is not the first or the last time that these debates have emerged about what exactly the name of a place should say about who we are, whether we in the past, in the present, or the future, regarding our institutions, our places, our organizations. And this is a picture from Somerville Main Street. All right, and we can move to the next slide. So with those two sides to the family, you have the Hardenbergh family and the Ruckers family. These families would collide in the person of Gerard Rutgers Hardenbergh in the middle of the 1800s when he was born in New Brunswick. That's the history. Now we'll take a look at the art behind this artist and ornithologist's work. Of course, the first name that often comes to mind when people see an exhibition like this is the name of John James Audubon. And Audubon, in the earlier part of the 19th century, of course, assembled his collection, The Birds of America, a really thorough and exhaustive depiction in art and ornithology. So taking an interest in both the depiction of the birds, but also in understanding biologically where they were from, where they lived. I've chosen as a sample the American goldfinch, New Jersey's state bird, as depicted in Audubon's work. And you can see how he also includes the thistle, because you're kind of showing not just the bird itself, but what is the habitat in which it resides. I don't know of any particular connection between Gerard Rutgers Hardenbergh and Audubon besides the general field in which they worked. But Audubon, this is before Hardenbergh's lifetime, but he did travel in New Jersey, and in fact in 1829 lived on Cooper Street in Camden. He traveled to the Great Egg Harbor, and so kind of maybe that's the closest he came to the Barnegat Bay, Gerard Rutgers Hardenbergh's favorite place to depict the wildlife. And he also journeyed and depicted wildlife at a place called Mickle Swamp, which a curator at the New Jersey State Museum has sort of refound. You won't see Mickle Swamp on the map today, but it was an area between Camden and Gloucester City. And so just across, although he only lived in New Jersey that one year in 1829, we know that he also made many visits from Philadelphia when he would stay there before and afterwards. But Audubon, although of course he's transformative for this field of art and ornithology, we can go even back further in colonial history to find examples of this interest in birds and art. We'll look at the next slide. I like to bring in the case of Mark Catsby. And since we're in New Jersey again, here's Mark Catsby's goldfinch depiction. Mark Catsby was an English naturalist. He was born in England, and he had a sister who married and moved to Virginia. And in the 1710s, so this is several decades even before Queens College in New Jersey, Mark Catesby journeyed to Williamsburg, Virginia to visit his sister, ended up extending his visit several years because he was just so captivated by the wildlife. Not only the birds, Audubon is more specifically birds. Catesby was plants, all kinds of other animals, but birds, of course, were among them. And he was fascinated to discover this real wealth of biodiversity, we would use the term maybe today, that the North America held. On the right is in 1965, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation made sort of a docudrama about him, which, if not even for the history, is just great because of the lush 1960s footage of Virginia wildlife that it contains. Catesby, though, what he's doing here is not necessarily what's happening in the academy. This is unusual, but it is the beginning of a shift, kind of taking biology, they're not using that word yet, but the study out into the field. He's not just sitting in a college building thinking about what makes nature work. He's actually going out into the field and looking at it in its natural setting. Move to the next slide. The field of science really was often called natural philosophy in the 18th century. And so natural philosophy it's a shift from theology, right? You're not just assuming God behind everything. You're looking into the world to see what causes the world on its own terms. And so physics is involved, an early form of physics. But in this era too, natural philosophy can be tied to the realities of colonization, the realities of conquest and empire. What you have here is an image you might recognize. This is called the Bodleian plate. This was discovered at the Bodleian Library at Oxford when the Colonial Williamsburg restoration began under Rockefeller in the 1920s. And it was very useful to the restoration because it depicted some of the buildings, the College of William and Mary on the top, the Virginia Capitol on the right, on the left, and the Governor's Palace on the right, as they looked at the time of the colonial period. What you might not know is that the Bodleian plate isn't just a depiction of buildings. We'll click to the next slide. It's also a depiction of nature, of wildlife, and of the Native American people that the English colonists arriving in Virginia at this period encountered. And move to the next slide, we'll have a little bit of a closer look on that part of it. So I bring this in to kind of show a few elements to it, both how natural philosophy, of course, there was this fascination, as you see along the center of the picture here, both of the plants and the wildlife. These are, again, are plants that were totally unknown to English and European scholars and gardeners. At the same time, though, it's important to note the figures to the far left and to the far right are people, in this case, Powhatan people of Virginia. But in the view of the colonizers, these people really were not so much humans standing on their own. They're kind of inculcated into, in their sense, the land. And in the process of taking possession of the plants, you're also taking possession of a knowledge, right? Taking kind of control of that land, and would lead to, in many places, not only in Virginia, the dispossession of too many of these people. We are learning as well, right, as we continue to learn about the conservation and protection, that what these Europeans assumed was an untouched landscape was actually a very heavily cared for landscape, that American Indians in Virginia and throughout the North American continent had for generations practiced different methods of managing and caring for the landscapes. And perhaps we, and by we is obviously a tricky term, but generally speaking, conservation in the present is often kind of rediscovering where are areas that we should have prescribed burning, where are areas that we need to live in better communication with the rivers and waterways. And so from the beginning, this kind of quest of understanding and the reality of that quest for conquest and empire, we must kind of comprehend as so closely linked. And we'll move to the next slide. And so I've given you a little bit of 18th century history there. Well, where does this all come back to New Jersey? As far as I can tell, and I'm not a deep expert, we have natural philosophy taught both at Nassau Hall on the left, the College of New Jersey, Princeton, and at Queens College there on the right, the future Ruckers College. But nonetheless, that natural philosophy would be much more kind of theoretical, thinking about physical phenomenon more so than going out into the world itself and studying things biologically. That's what, about a half century later, Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh was on the cusp of. Although he is a Ruckers man, it's in his very name. He's born in New Brunswick. When he begins his scholarly career as an ornithologist, where does he send all his samples? To Princeton, as the exhibition at Morven kind of really helps to elucidate. But that was because Princeton kind of had one of the few professors of this 19th century period who was interested in this approach, really, again, studying biology as a field subject, going out and examining species as opposed to simply reflecting on it from the comfort of a home. At the same time, of course, though, Ruckers would win out in that battle for the land grant, and so Ruckers would in the next century take on the great status of a agricultural and scientific college. But it's kind of fascinating to me to consider, although we talk about these as colonial colleges, the back and forth collaboration through these many centuries between them. And we'll move to the next slide. And with this part, we will move into our third part of our hike. We've done history, we've done nature, we've done art, and so we'll look at nature. I find really fascinating, of course, if you've been to the exhibition at Morven, one of the real treasures that they've pointed out there is that you get to see a landscape just on the cusp of major development and major industrialization, and particularly a lot of these shore landscapes, which in some cases are just modified beyond recognition, where different canals have been cut out and the water itself and the ecology has changed. Those cannot be returned to their earlier appearance. But even where other places just have simply been developed, where now homes, neighborhoods, whole towns sit, where Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh, in the time that he worked along the Barnegat Bay, found only natural landscapes. I will modify that perspective. I think it's a fascinating one, but what I'll try to suggest is if you know where to look, not saying it's easy, but if you know where to look, there are still a few little slivers and places where you can go and have your own hike, or if you have it, a houseboat ride, and you can get out and see, if not in its totality, places where some of that wild New Jersey shore still survives. And also places where we, as the conservationists and the people of New Jersey today, can work and are working to protect what is there and help revive places where it's been lost. To begin, if you haven't been to the exhibition, Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh was an artist who worked mainly along the Barnegat Bay. And there's much more information of it on his career at the exhibition at Morven. But I thought interesting to bring in was the notion that the Barnegat Bay itself, we began with the Jersey Dutch roots of this artist and ornithologist, has a Dutch name, or at least a broken Dutch name. When the Dutch explorers, or at least a Dutch ship led by an Englishman, Henry Hudson, on the Half Moon sailed along the Jersey shore in 1609, they were searching for a Northwest Passage, as so many European travelers or explorers of the American continent were. They sort of went up the Delaware Bay, saw, no, this is too rough, no way that this leads to Asia. They continued up along the what we would call today the Jersey Shore. And when they approached some of these inlets, they noticed how rough again the breakers were here. And so they gave it this name, Barnegat. And in Barnegat Dutch, simply speaking, it means the place of the breakers, but with a little more kind of figurative speech to it, it really means a place of swirling water and power. So it's a name really describing the natural feature of the water itself. By the 18th century, so it's not recent that that name changed. By the 18th century, by the time of the American Revolution, it was known as the Barnegat Bay. But that's all kind of a corruption of the original or the earlier Dutch name given to this area, the Barnegat. I don't think Gerard Hardenbergh was aware of that, but it's interesting for us to kind of think of him in this long tradition of the Dutch, the Jersey Dutch in this region. So move to the next slide. And so since I am here on behalf of our State Park Service, the two places I'll highlight to you are New Jersey state parks and historic sites. Island Beach State Park is, of course, one of our crown jewels in our state park system. And I'm sure many of you will know it as a beautiful place for ocean bathing, the great recreation areas facing the Atlantic Ocean, great for the beach in the summer, and you get to see the horseshoe crabs and all them climbing along the landscape. And rightly so, those areas are very well known and are great to visit. But a lot lesser known is the other side of Island Beach State Park. If you turn away from the big, massive parking lots and swimming areas, you will find a whole nother region that is really a haven for wildlife. Of course, most of the Jersey Shore is developed today, right? We've got our boardwalks and our hotels and our shore houses and homes and residences too. But along this kind of 9-mile stretch of Island Beach State Park, you can find what really is the last intact natural shore ecosystem along the Atlantic Ocean. And so behind on the west side, on the bay side of the park, you will find a whole network of trails that usually have nowhere near the crowds that you'll find on the beach side, but also really offer a lot of reward, because if you're not a super big hiker, you might want to bring your boots depending on the time of year if it's too wet. But if you're not a super big hiker, you really don't have to go far. These are about a half mile to a mile, and it feels like you're in a another place totally removed from the seaside resorts. And you can see there is even the birds are a big part of it. Here's a little bird viewing cottage that you can find on a trail at Island Beach State Park on the right. And then also on the left, some of the perches that have been used to help invite the osprey back to this region. It's a critical area of the Jersey Shore where birds will migrate from far north to far south throughout the year. And this is really one of the only places where those birds can find a fully intact natural maritime ecosystem. The dunes are an important part, and then behind those dunes grows this kind of really unique kind of both plant life and also wildlife. And we'll move to the next slide. And just down the shore, and we're getting a little bit out of what I understand was probably Gerard Hardenbergh's territory. He was up on the very north tip of the Barnegat Bay at Bay Head. We're here on the very southern tip and across the inlet at Barnegat Lighthouse State Park. But I like this shot too, because not only does Barnegat Lighthouse State Park preserve a small maritime forest on what is otherwise a heavily developed Long Beach Island, but this is a place where we see the return in cases of the natural wildlife that Gerard Hardenbergh depicted. Right in front of you is a massive tidal pool, and our Division of Parks and Forestry and Division of Fish and Wildlife, with, of course, Rutgers University, that happens to coincidentally bear that name that our artist bore, they are working together to make habitat for the piping plover. And so during the appropriate times of the year, they will cordon off entire parts of this park, especially around the water, and this gives them the chicks. So the mother plover can lay their eggs, and it gives the chicks the vital access they need, both to the sand in which they lived, but to the tidal pools where they can really get something to eat before they fly off and begin their own migratory lives. Keeping in mind, I'm an historian, not a naturalist, so I am not doing nearly enough justice to the kind of biological phenomena at play here. But I wanted to kind of invite you to consider these areas and consider too, we have the great gift, because of Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh, of so much of that landscape and wildlife preserved in painting. Hopefully, if we do our job the right way over the next years, it won't be only in Gerard Hardenbergh's paintings that you can still find these great species along our Jersey Shore. And this project on the Barnegat Lighthouse State Park is really one of the vital and most successful areas where that work is already taking place. We'll go to the next slide. And so to finish up, we've had our virtual Hardenbergh hike. I'll ask you, or give you the invitation to make up your own Hardenbergh hike on your own. If you're here in New Jersey, of course, you can start off at our old Dutch parsonage. And I'm glad to invite you to look us up. We do tours throughout the year. This month especially, we have tours focused on the 250th anniversary of teaching at Rutgers. So if I've just whet your appetite for a little more on Queens College and these Hardenbergh and Frelinghuysen families, check out those tours. You will know, I hope you know by now, that just down the road at Princeton and Morven Museum and Garden through the end of the year and just a little bit into the early next year, you can see the great collection of these paintings. Thankfully, there is a great book, which I know is also available through Morven, that really assembles those Hardenbergh paintings in print form. But to my knowledge, at least, this is really a very rare, at least first, right, instance where you as a general visitor, as a museum goer, can really see them all assembled in one place in New Jersey. And so if you've not gone yet, do go again, or go a second time now that you've got all this little extra stuff to think about. If you were doing it before this year is out, you can follow your trail to the New Jersey State Museum, where at the same moment, they have on exhibit an exhibition on fine feathered friends, exploring birds not only in art, but throughout New Jersey life. You'll get some of the information that I talked about earlier, including the research on Audubon in New Jersey. But you'll also get, of course, since you're in Trenton, some beautiful Trenton porcelain out of the beam factories that made birds, including birds of peace that are on display as far away as the Vatican Museum's gifts to the Pope, right? So Trenton does make, and that's a great place to explore that. But it's a hike, so you got to get outside at least a little bit. And I would suggest Island Beach and Barnegat Lighthouse State Parks as great places to see some of that landscape. Again, even if you're not a big hiker, bring your boots and bring your bug spray, depending on when you go. But it's nice because not right now as it's dark, but even during the daylight in the winter time, that's actually better because there's no big crowds for the swimming areas. You can get out, look up our trails maps online, and find a short walk and get a bracing look at the natural side of the beaches, or beyond the state parks too. Take a closer look, and maybe some of the towns and counties along the shore as well, I know, have some great sites too, that if not the exact ones that Hardenbergh worked, will evoke that region. And with the last slide, you can move it over, Debbie. That will conclude my portion. And like I said, I'm presenting from Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage, but you can use those as a gateway to explore so many of these great topics of art, history, and nature in New Jersey that collide together. With that, Debbie, you can either remove it or however you'd like, and I'm happy to take any questions too if those come up. Whoops, I don't think we have your sound on, Debbie.
Sorry there. That was magnificent. And I hope everyone enjoyed, isn't too exhausted and enjoyed that tour and hike. But really, you took us all around the state and really enforced how wonderful our collection at the museum is to record this, but also that great background on Rutgers, the Rutgers and Hardenbergh families. So if there are some questions, I see there's one in the chat. Someone is reminding us the book that Paul mentions is Gerard Rutgers Hardenbergh, Artist and Ornithologist by Patricia H. Burke. And Pat Burke was essential in the curation of the current exhibition. And she actually did several gallery walks for us as well. Does anyone have any other questions for Paul? I mean, really, it was so engaging. Sure. Everything I
appreciate, I appreciate you all coming along, because I know it looks a little winding at first, but I think as we've come around it, you'll see how my Hardenbergh hike comes together, and hopefully really does complement the, I'm just giving you the stories behind it. It's really the art at Morven that's you got to see. And since we have the book here mentioned, I had the great benefit that Pat Burke actually visited the Old Dutch Parsonage over the summer. And I will also point out as another little piece of trivia, if you haven't read it yet, in her book, Tom Van Nostren, I got his name right, the collector who's loaned a lot of the artworks that you have on display, just to make the Jersey Dutch more confusing, he, long after he started collecting Hardenbergh, learned that through his own family connection, he is a descendant of Dina van Berg through the Frelinghuysen family.
Oh,
He
interesting.
is a descendant of Eva Frelinghuysen, one of the daughters of the first marriage. So he's not a direct relation to Hardenbergh, but he is linked through Dina van Berg
That's really interesting.
family.
So a question came
Yeah,
through
sure.
me. Was it always called the Old Dutch Parsonage, or when did it become?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Yes, of course. Yes. So Old Dutch Parsonage is kind of one of these, I'd imagine, colonial revival names that sort of ends up being applied to the house. I actually don't know when it becomes like regularly called that, because I've not done, again, exhaustive research, but basically the Old Dutch Parsonage, if you want to call it, when it was preserved, right, when it kind of changes from being just a house into a museum, would be in 1913, when the Jersey Central Railroad bought the house. It was only a parsonage a few years after Reverend Hardenbergh. So by the early 1800s, it becomes a private home. And then it was pretty much empty. The owners no longer lived there. It became vacant for a long time. And then in 1912, the Jersey Central Railroad purchased the house with the intention of demolishing it. They were raising up the embankment for the railroad tracks that today are New Jersey Transit's Raritan Valley line, and that still serves Somerville today. And there was a lot of local resistance, local support for saving the house. Senator Frelinghuysen, Joseph Frelinghuysen, so that generation's Frelinghuysen politician, he financed the relocation of the house about 300 yards to where it sits today. The reason I gave you that backstory is just because even when I've seen that, I usually see it referred to as the Dowdy House, which was the name of the private owners who held it last, or as the Frelinghuysen House. They don't always use the Old Dutch Parsonage, but I know the Historic American Building Survey, so that'd be about 1930s probably. I think it is called Frelinghuysen Parsonage or Old Dutch Parsonage. No, so that's a name that we have given it in the present. In its own time, it was probably, from what I understand, domine was the term they probably used for their minister. So although they're Dutch, that's a Latin term, but they would have called him the domine, kind of the minister. So it would be the domine's house. And the Old Dutch Parsonage itself was not attached to one church. It was kind of a central location from which the minister and residents would travel to several churches all around the Raritan River Valley. Which happens a lot with the churches in this period. You don't have a lot of trained ministers, and people are scattered. So one minister kind of travels and shares a bunch of churches. So, but yeah, in short, yeah, that's a. Of course, it wasn't the Old Dutch Parsonage when it was built, and yeah, that name comes in kind of as a historic name for it.
So, if we were to visit your site,
Sure.
Are there regular tours? What would we find?
Yeah, sure. So right now, through the year end, what we have is mostly on Sunday afternoons at 1 o'clock. We do a regular historic houses tour that discusses both the Old Dutch Parsonage as a minister's residence and the neighboring Wallace House as George Washington's winter headquarters. And at 3 o'clock, I have my special tour for this season is related to the anniversary that we observe this week. 255 years ago was the charter that established Queen's College, but it took them another 5 years to actually get up and running and teaching. And this week is also the anniversary of that occasion. On the second Tuesday of November 1771, Frederick Frelinghuysen, the first minister's son, the founder of Ruckers' stepson, he offered the first lessons for Queen's College. And those were offered out of the sign of the Red Lion Tavern, which no longer stands, but was on the waterfront in New Brunswick. So we're on that tour talking about the early origins of Princeton and Rutgers, and concluding it with a little visit to a temporary tavern I have on display, talking about the role of taverns in this period. And why, although that seems a bit of a surprise, why would you put a college in a tavern? It actually kind of makes sense when you consider the context of that period. For the details, Wallace Dutch at .eventbrite or on Facebook at Wallace Dutch are the best ways to get kind of up-to-date information there.
Having visited your site, you always do such nice, presentations, and you really do make it interesting. And I have a post here, a question here
Okay.
From Liza Morehouse, who's actually the president of Morven Museum and Garden.
Okay, great.
And she said, "You've given us wonderful and lively insights. Thank you. How did you become so well versed in this area?"
Oh, sure. Well, like I said, for this particular subject, Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh, it was kind of, I had begun my position at Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage, so I'm an interpreter for those two historic houses, in 2019, I guess. And sometime later that fall probably was when I guess Morven started to release the publicity for what was planned as a 2020 exhibit and obviously became a 2021 exhibit with the COVID delays. And just when I saw that, I saw Gerard Ruckers Hardenbergh and those names, I said, okay, there is something going on here that is related to the Old Dutch Parsonage, which I just kind of started to really dive deep into to try to understand it. That explains my interest in kind of this particular subject. I guess more broadly, yeah, I studied at William and Mary College in Virginia, which was kind of cool for me to then be able to move into this back in my home state of New Jersey position, where I now am the interpreter of the only other colonial college to turn into a public university. So William and Mary and Rutgers kind of share a bond. I don't know if anyone else besides me has noticed, but that we are the only colonial colleges that did not enter the Ivy League and instead became public universities in their respective states. And so I bring that interest, and also as a New Jersey man, I guess. Yeah, I found it even more interesting when I really learned like the Barnegat Bay. I guess I was always an Island Beach State Park goer as a kid in the summers, and only recently have discovered, oh wow, there's this whole kind of natural world there too. And so it helps when it's something you enjoy, I guess, that I'm able to bring to that discussion. So kind of a combination of those subjects coming together.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think you've
Yeah, and
sparked
I'll
a lot
mention
of-
too, yeah, just to give my credit where due, of course, the Patricia Burke book really elucidated the history of Hardenbergh himself to me, the artist, I mean. So I will have to give full credit to that. I'm giving you background, but it's Pat Burke and Tom Van Nostrand who've really done the work, and Morven Museum to bring the artist himself, someone I had never heard of before this exhibition.
Well, you certainly have given all of us great insights. And as Paul has said, I do hope you come to Morven and see the exhibition. And I do hope you go visit Wallace House and the Old Dutch Parsonage. And again, thank you so much. If there are any other questions, I don't see any right now, but I will have this recording for you so you can all go back through and re-envision your own hike. So thank you again, Paul, for everything, and all have a good evening.
Sure, thanks so much for coming along.